Hey there, my friend. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, I want you to get comfortable wherever you are. Maybe you're lying in bed with the lights low, maybe you're listening on a night shift, or with headphones on in a quiet room. And I'd really love it if you'd tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Which city, which country, maybe even what time it is for you right now. Because it always amazes me how these stories travel all over the world and somehow still end up in the dark, quiet room where you are, just trying to fall asleep. If this kind of slow, calm, sleepy storytelling helps you relax, don't forget to tap like, subscribe to the channel, and maybe even share it with someone else who has trouble sleeping. It really helps more than you think. And now, let's go straight into tonight's story. Tonight, we're going deep into a canyon, into a place that sounds like it should be a punishment, but became one man's kingdom, a place called Hell's Canyon, and the life of a man who decided that the modern world had nothing left to offer him. So he walked away and rebuilt his own version of civilization with his bare hands, one stone, one log, one tool at a time, far from banks and bosses and time clocks, and far from everything that was supposed to define success in the 20th century. I want you to imagine that we're not starting in the 1930s, but in the warm light of a summer afternoon in 1966, when the world already thinks it knows what progress looks like, with freeways and television and suburbs spreading like quilt patterns across the continent, and yet out there in the wilds of Idaho there is still a rumor, still a ghost of the Old West, a name people whisper with half a smile and half disbelief: Buckskin Bill, the last of the mountain men. Now picture a narrow jet boat nosing its way up a fast, muscular river, the Salmon River, deep in the gut of a canyon that feels more like a wound than a landscape. The cliffs rising on either side like dark, folded walls, the water slapping at the hull, and on the boat a writer from Sports Illustrated named Harold Peterson, squinting into the glare, clutching his notebook, wondering if this is all a big joke, if the last mountain man is just going to turn out to be a cranky old guy in a shack with a rusty rifle and a few tall tales. The engine drones, the wind smells of hot rock and river water and distant pine, and as the boat slides round a bend, the canyon suddenly opens into a small pocket of gentler land, a little bar of green, a place they call 5 Mile Bar, 50 acres of stubborn flat ground clinging to the side of the river like a secret terrace, with a few trees, some cultivated soil, and shapes that don't look wild at all. Stone walls, wooden beams, the unmistakable geometry of a human-made home. The engine cuts, the noise fades into echo, and for a moment there is only the hiss of the river and the ticking of the cooling metal. Then, from the shade of the trees, a figure steps out, and this is the moment where Harold expects to see a ragged hermit, dirty and half-wild, but what he actually sees knocks the breath out of him and quietly changes the way he thinks about the word primitive. The man standing on the riverbank is dressed head to toe in buckskin, but the buckskin is not filthy or torn, it is clean and well cut, the seams neat, the fringe carefully placed, and on his head he wears something so strange and yet so deliberate that Peterson can't help staring: a hand-stitched leather helmet, shaped almost like the ornate headgear of the Swiss Guard in Rome, with curves and flaps and a proud, slightly comic silhouette, and somehow it looks completely at home here, in the middle of this wilderness. The man is smiling, not the shy, suspicious smile of someone who wants you to go away, but the warm, amused smile of a host welcoming a guest. He walks down to the landing with an easy, deliberate step, holds out his hand and speaks in clear, articulate sentences that sound more like a professor than a mountain trapper, and before Harold has time to adjust his assumptions, the man is inviting him up to see the place, not with embarrassment, not with apology, but with the quiet pride of a craftsman saying, "Come and look at what I have made." He expects a cabin, maybe a shed, a smoky one-room box with a rough bed and a cast-iron stove, but what he finds is a 2-story stone and timber lodge, the lower story snugged into the hillside like a badger's den, the upper story facing the breeze, the walls carefully laid, the beams properly joined, the whole thing clearly built with an understanding of the brutal temperature swings that rule this canyon, where summers can burn and winters can bite to the bone. It is not fancy, but it is clever, and that cleverness hangs in the air like a second structure, invisible but solid. He expects to see a campfire ringed with blackened stones, and maybe a dented coffee pot, but instead he is shown a gleaming, almost regal contraption in the kitchen. A tall, hand-forged samovar of copper and brass, shaped like something you might encounter in an old Russian palace, with curves and rivets and a little spigot, a machine for making tea in the middle of nowhere, hammered into existence by this same man in buckskin, working alone. Then he is taken to the workshop, a blacksmith's corner that smells of coal dust and hot metal, where tools hang in careful rows, their handles smooth from use, and in a rack on the wall and a case on the table lie rifles and pistols that at first glance might be store-bought Winchesters, until the man, whose name is Sylvan Hart, but who will be remembered as Buckskin Bill, casually mentions that he made them himself, not from parts and kits, but from raw steel, from bars and scraps and old mining trash, the barrels bored straight by hand, the firing mechanisms forged and filed, the stocks carved from canyon wood, and even the bullets cast and trimmed right here in this little pocket of wilderness. In that moment, as Harold Peterson takes in the gunmetal and the stone walls and the samovar gleaming in the dim light, he realizes he is not standing in the shack of a man who ran away from the 20th century because it was too hard. He is standing in the private kingdom of a man who looked at the 20th century and said, "Fine. If I can't trust your system, I will rebuild it myself, in miniature, with my own fingers, where nobody can take it away from me." And that realization is what sends the writer's mind spiraling backwards in time, back to the day when this strange, smiling, buckskin-clad scholar of the wilderness decided to walk out of ordinary life and down into Hell's Canyon. To understand that choice, we have to drift back to 1932, to the flat, hot expanse of the Texas oil fields, where the air shimmers with heat and smells of grease and sweat, and drills pound their way into the earth, while men in stained shirts and heavy boots wrestle pipe and cable under a sun that never seems to move. Somewhere among them is a young roughneck, 26 years old, named Sylvan Hart, and if you pass him on the rig you might not notice anything unusual, but if you could see the inside of his world you'd find Latin and Greek phrases floating next to oil prices, and the ghosts of European philosophers hovering over the clanging steel. He is not like the other men, not because he is better, but because he has taken a very different path to end up in the same place. He has a degree in English from McPherson College, he has done time at the University of Oklahoma, he reads voraciously, he teaches himself languages for the sheer pleasure of feeling new sounds in his mouth, German and Russian and French and Spanish, even Swahili and Norwegian, and yet in the Great Depression, when the stock market has fallen apart and unemployment has chewed a quarter of the country to the bone, all that education has funneled him here, to a job that stains his hands and exhausts his body, and leaves his mind pacing like a caged animal. Around him he sees men crushed by forces they do not control, men with families whose lives depend entirely on whether the company keeps them on this month, men whose futures hang on decisions made in distant offices by people they will never meet. Debts pile up, banks close, farms fail, and the American dream, that bright promise of work hard and you will be safe, feels more and more like a worn-out slogan painted on a wall nobody bothered to repaint. Sylvan is smart enough to see the pattern, and as he watches paychecks wobble and savings vanish and proud men bow their heads in front of supervisors, a slow, stubborn thought begins to take shape, that this system of money and bosses and banks is not just temporarily broken, it is dangerous, because it asks you to place your survival, your very ability to eat and be sheltered, in the hands of something you cannot touch or fix, something that can fail and leave you stranded. And he realizes that as long as he needs a company and a wage and a store, his life is in a very real way not his own. One day, surrounded by the metallic pounding, the shouted instructions, the smell of oil and dust and quiet desperation. He makes a decision that sounds almost childish at first, like the fantasy of a boy running away from home, but that will turn out to be one of the most radical acts of self-determination of his century. He decides he is done not just with this job or this oil field, but with the entire artifice of 20th century dependence, and he begins to dream not of a promotion or a transfer, but of a place so remote that the modern world will simply forget he exists there. When he imagines wealth, he no longer sees numbers in a bank ledger or houses lined up on neat suburban streets. He sees skill, the feel of tools that belong to him, and that he knows how to make. A garden that doesn't depend on a grocery store, walls he has built with his own hands, a rifle he has forged himself, and a roof over his head that can't be foreclosed because there is no mortgage and no bank, only rock and wood anchored in the hillside. So he packs what little he has, more ideas than possessions, and turns his eyes northward, toward Idaho, toward a river and a canyon he has only read about in scraps and heard about in passing, a place with a grim name and a complicated beauty, and he goes searching for the kind of land the system has ignored, the kind that lies just far enough off the map that nobody else wanted it. Hell's Canyon, when he reaches it, does not look like an invitation. It looks like a warning. If you've ever seen the Grand Canyon, you know what a canyon is supposed to be. Wide, dramatic, open to the sky like a stone amphitheater. But Hell's Canyon is deeper, tighter, stranger, a cut in the earth that at its deepest dives almost 8,000 feet from the mountain tops to the churning river below. A place where the walls lean in, and the river, the salmon, is not a gentle scenic stream, but a powerful, restless current that early explorers looked at and said, "No, that is madness," and called it the river of no return. Yet down there, along that dangerous ribbon of water, on a stretch of rough ground called 5 Mile Bar, 50 acres of brush and rock and promise, Sylvan Hart finds exactly what he has been looking for. A forgotten scrap of the American West, beautiful and brutal, fertile in patches and unforgiving in others, a place where no one has bothered to build roads or string power lines, where the system's reach feels suddenly very short. He buys it for $1, a single piece of paper that transfers this pocket of earth into his care, and although it is technically a real estate transaction, what he is truly purchasing is something much larger and much stranger, the chance to test whether a human being, alone, with knowledge and determination, can build a complete functioning life from raw earth and sky, without the usual safety nets and supply chains. A little experiment in radical freedom that will last almost half a century. But freedom, as the canyon will immediately remind him, is not a soft romantic word here. It is a sharp-edged reality with a cost, and the bill arrives in the winter of 1932-33. He comes into the canyon with far less than a homesteader was supposed to have, carrying an axe, a few traps, some simple gear, and a head full of books and theories. He scrapes together a temporary shelter, a dugout half sunk into the earth, roofed over and lined as best he can with what he has at hand, thinking that it will be enough to see him through that first season while he plans something better. But Hell's Canyon does not care about plans. In summer, the heat presses down like a hand, temperatures climbing toward 120 degrees Fahrenheit on the exposed rocks, and in winter the canyon performs a quiet trick of physics that will nearly kill him. Cold, heavy air slides down from the heights and settles at the bottom like invisible water in a bowl, turning the river corridor into a long, narrow freezer, where the stillness of the air makes the cold feel personal, as if it is choosing to sit right on your chest. That winter the thermometer plunges to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and stays below zero not for a night or two, but for week after week, 47 consecutive days of hard cold between mid-December and the end of January, the kind of cold that makes wood crack and metal sing and breath turn instantly to frost on a beard. The salmon river itself, that flexing, surging animal of water, chokes with ice and slows, then freezes in places, as if the whole world is tightening. In his crude dugout, Sylvan discovers that intellect without skill is a very fragile blanket. His books cannot block the wind that finds every crack. His knowledge of Latin and Greek cannot split frozen logs any faster. His theories about self-reliance do not light a damp match, and night after night he lies there, wrapped in whatever blankets and clothing he owns, listening to the wind scrape down the canyon, feeling the cold creeping in like a slow tide, and realizing just how unprepared he truly is. He burns through his neatly stacked pile of firewood faster than he had imagined, because when the air is that cold, the stove or the fireplace becomes a living mouth that must be fed constantly. And by mid-January he has to turn to sagebrush, tough, aromatic shrubs that burn hot and bright and fast, forcing him into a rhythm of 2-hour sleeps, waking shivering to stuff more fuel into the flames, and then collapsing back into a shallow, exhausted doze, while his body grows thinner and his hands stiffen and crack in the dry cold. He loses more than 20 pounds over that winter, the flesh melting off his frame as if the canyon is taking a tax. Frostbite nibbles at his fingers, his lips split and bleed, and the dugout, which had seemed like a clever solution when he first dug it, now feels more like a hole in the ground where the cold has come to visit. And in those long, dark nights, he understands that this place will not allow him to bluff his way through with good intentions and book learning. It will demand real, specific skills and real physical labor, thousands of hours of it. Yet, in that same bitter season, something else happens quietly inside him. The part of him that still belonged to the oil fields, to paychecks and supervisors and clock-in times, gets burned away, and what walks out of that winter into the pale, new sunlight of spring 1933 is a man who has been humbled and hardened, who has seen how close failure can come, and who has decided not to flee back to town, but to stay and build something worthy of the suffering he has already endured. Where another man might say, "This is impossible, I was wrong," Sylvan looks up at the canyon walls, feels the scars on his fingers, and says, "All right, then I must become the kind of person who can live here." And with that decision the true work of Buckskin Bill begins. The long, slow project of turning Hell's Canyon into home. He starts sensibly with shelter, because he now knows that a shallow hole will not be enough, and he designs not a simple one-room cabin, but a 2-story lodge of stone and timber, with the lower level dug into the hillside to borrow the insulating mass of the earth for winter, and an upper level that can catch the breezes and radiate heat away in the crushing summer. A house whose very shape and layout are answers to the specific problems of this specific landscape. There are no trucks to bring in materials, no lumberyard, no crew. There is only Sylvan, his tools, the rock of the canyon, and the timber on its slopes. So he turns himself into a quarryman and a logger and a mule all at once, prying stone from outcrops, shaping it with patient blows, felling trees with his axe, trimming them, and then hauling everything piece by piece down the steep ground to his chosen building site, his back learning the weight of every block and beam. He finds limestone upstream and burns it in a crude kiln to make lime, mixes it with sand from the river to create mortar, learns through trial and error how wet it must be, how fast it sets in this dry air, and he fits the stones together until the walls rise with a kind of rough elegance, each rock held not just by mortar but by the thought he has put into its place. He notches logs for the upper frame, chinks the gaps with moss and clay, until what once was a dugout is replaced by something that feels almost like a little fortress, a home that belongs to this canyon as much as the cliffs and the river do. It takes him 2 full years of steady labor to bring this lodge into being, 2 cycles of scorching summer and freezing winter, and when at last he can stand back and look at it, he is not finished at all, because a house, he knows now, is only the shell of a life, and if he is going to be truly free here, if he is going to sever his dependence on the outside world as much as any modern man can, he will need tools, and if he is going to need tools, then he will have to make them himself. So the next phase of his kingdom is born out of a simple realization. Before anything else, he needs fire and steel that obey his will. which means he needs a forge and an anvil, and a corner of his little domain that will become, in time, the beating heart of his self-sufficient civilization. He chooses a small, sheltered patch of ground just beyond the new stone house, a place where the canyon wind doesn't cut straight through, a spot pressed against the natural wall of rock so he can use the cliff itself as the backbone of his workshop. And there he begins to build not just a shed, not just a workspace, but the beating heart of an entire handmade civilization, a forge shaped from river stones and fire clay, its mouth dark and cavernous, waiting for the day when, under his hands, cold scraps of abandoned mining iron will glow orange and then white and finally yield to the hammer like softened bread. He builds the bellows next, because a forge without breath is nothing but a cold fireplace. And with the same calm patience he has learned from the canyon, he stretches deer hide over a wooden frame, fits the boards together until the seams are tight, and adds a long hollow reed of wood as the throat through which air will rush into the fire. And when he tests it for the first time, pressing down and feeling the whoosh of air pour out, he smiles at how alive the forge suddenly feels, because now it can inhale and exhale like a beast preparing to wake. Soon the shop fills with the smells of hot metal and coal smoke, a scent that will cling to him for the rest of his life, and in this glow he begins shaping the tools that will shape his future, hammers that sit perfectly in his hand, chisels as sharp as the cold wind, saws with teeth that bite clean and true, knives with handles carved from deer antlers, each tool an extension of his will, each stroke of the hammer a declaration of independence from every store, every factory, every place he once had to rely on. And then, as if all this were only a warm-up for what he truly intends, he turns his attention to the craft that will become the legend whispered up and down the canyon. Gunsmithing. Not the assembly line kind, but the primordial, almost monastic practice of forging a weapon from nothing, but raw steel, fire, and knowledge. He scavenges metal from the skeletons of old mining camps, broken picks, rusted saw teeth, abandoned chains, hauls them back piece by piece, lays them on his anvil, and coaxes them back to life under the rhythmic ringing of the hammer. He straightens, heats, folds, and tempers them, his eyes narrowed against the sparks, until the metal becomes obedient again, ready to be reshaped into something purposeful. But the real miracle, the one visiting engineers still shake their heads at, begins when he decides to make barrels, because boring a rifle barrel by hand is a task that even trained craftsmen with machines will hesitate before attempting. And yet here, in this isolated canyon, Sylvan Hart, Buckskin Bill, builds a hand-cranked drill out of scrap and begins the slow, almost meditative process of turning solid steel into a straight, perfect tunnel. He works for hours, for days, for weeks, advancing the sharpened bit only a fraction of an inch at a time, withdrawing it, cleaning it, checking alignment by sighting down the growing tunnel toward the morning light, adjusting, correcting, never rushing, and in the quiet of the canyon, the tiny scraping sound of metal shaving away becomes its own kind of music, a hymn to patience, to skill, to absolute determination. When the barrel is finally hollowed, he begins rifling it, cutting the spiral grooves that will give the bullet its spin, and he invents his own rifling guide, a long rod with teeth carved into a precise spiral, feeding it through the bore again and again, shaving deeper each time, careful not to weaken the steel, careful not to let the groove wander even a hair's width off course. And when he finishes, he has not just a barrel but a piece of art, a piece of mathematics, a piece of pure solitary craftsmanship. He carves stocks from canyon hardwood, smoothing them with stone, shaping them so they rest naturally against the shoulder, polishing them until the grain glows warm in the firelight. He melts lead in hand-carved molds to cast bullets, tests each gun hundreds of times, refining the trigger pull, adjusting the sights, refusing to accept anything less than perfection, because out here one mistake could cost him a winter of meat. And as these weapons take shape in his hands, sleek, functional, deadly beautiful, His workshop becomes something more than a place of labor. It becomes a declaration that he has not escaped the 20th century at all, but rebuilt it on his own terms, one glowing piece of metal at a time, in a canyon most people would never dare to enter, let alone call home. He learns, slowly and through burned fingers and long nights, that the forge is more than a place where metal softens. It is the center of an entire philosophy, a place where the modern world loses its power over him, because each time he shapes steel into something useful, he also shapes his own freedom, carving away his dependence on factories and stores, until all that remains is a man and his tools, as ancient and as modern as any craftsman who has ever lived. But tools alone cannot sustain him, and as the seasons rotate like great wheels overhead, Sylvan turns his attention to clothing, because in Hell's Canyon the cold is a predator that stalks quietly and without mercy, and he knows that woven cotton and store-bought jackets will not save him when winter sinks into the river valley like a frozen tide. So he hunts deer, not for sport but for survival, moving through the canyon with the silent patience of someone who knows that every pelt, every sinew, every bone will become part of his system of self-reliance. And when he brings down a deer, he uses almost every piece of it, thanking the animal in the quiet way of those who live close to their food. He skins the hide carefully, scraping away fat and membrane with a curved tool he made from a polished deer leg bone, working the surface until it is clean and smooth. Then he prepares the brain solution, a strange, earthy mixture created from the deer's own brain, because the oils in it contain just the right chemistry to soften the hide, and he kneads the wet skin for hours, stretching and pulling it until the fibers loosen and the leather becomes supple under his hands. He smokes the hide over green wood, watching the pale tendrils of smoke curl into the air, infusing the leather with that warm, honeyed color that will become his signature. Buckskin Bill, the man in the tanned buckskin clothes, and when it is fully cured he cuts the hide into shirts, pants, gloves, and moccasins. Every seam sewn with sinew thread split from deer tendons, stronger than anything he could have bought, swelling and tightening when wet to create seams that hold even through snowstorms and river crossings. It is an old craft, thousands of years old, but in the canyon it feels timeless, as though he is joining hands with every hunter and trapper and woodsman who came before him. And when he finishes his outfit, his shirts fringed not for decoration but to channel rainwater, his double-thick moccasin soles stitched from the toughest back hide, his strange, clever helmet stuffed with dried grass for insulation, he feels fitted to the land, armored not in steel but in knowledge. And with clothing and tools and shelter slowly falling into place, he turns next to the one thing that will ultimately determine whether he can stay here for a season or for a lifetime. Food, not as a scavenger, but as a farmer, a grower, a steward of soil in one of the most unlikely agricultural pockets in North America. Most men would look at 5 Mile Bar, its thin rocky soil, its steep slopes, its fierce sun, and see discouragement, but Sylvan sees potential, because he understands that soil is not a fixed thing. It is a living substance that can be amended, shaped, improved, and so he begins carrying baskets of nutrient-rich soil from the riverbank, load after load, up the slope of his property, mixing it into the volcanic dirt until it becomes something that can cradle roots. He builds terraces from stone, stacking flat rocks into walls that hold back erosion, and create level steps of earth where vegetables can grow without being washed away by storms. He digs an irrigation ditch from a spring higher up the canyon, channeling water through wooden troughs and stone-lined channels, a miniature river network that feeds his crops even in the driest months. And when the first shoots appear, potatoes, beans, squash, carrots, herbs, the garden becomes more than sustenance. It becomes proof that this land, harsh as it is, will answer him if he works with it instead of against it. It becomes the quiet heartbeat of his future, a promise that he will not starve when winter comes again. He saves seeds from the strongest plants, selecting year after year for traits the canyon rewards, heat tolerance, cold tolerance, resistance to rocky soil, and over time his crops evolve, becoming heirlooms unique to his valley, strains no catalogue will ever list, but perfectly suited to the microclimate of this deep-cut gorge. Each autumn he harvests thousands of pounds of potatoes, gathering them by lamplight, storing them in a root cellar carved into the hillside, where the temperature stays steady and forgiving. He dries beans and corn, ferments cabbage into sauerkraut in wooden barrels, smokes fish and jerky, until the air around the lodge is heavy with the scent of preservation, and by the time the first snow dusts the canyon rim, his stores are full and ready. And now we move into the rhythm that will define decades of his life. A rhythm like a slow, ancient drumbeat, spring planting, summer tending, fall harvesting, winter reading, and repairing and enduring. A cycle that repeats itself with such steady certainty that time begins to feel different down here. Not like a calendar, but like a turning wheel, a great loop pulling him deeper into the fabric of the place. Through all of this, Sylvan's days begin before sunrise. Whether it is mid-July or the frozen core of January, he steps out of his lodge into the cold morning air, listens to the river, checks the wind, notes the color of the sky, reads the subtle signs the canyon offers. Not superstition, but the science of someone who has lived long enough in one place to understand its language. Breakfast is simple: venison jerky, dried fruit, tea brewed from his magnificent hand-forged samovar, the copper body glowing gently in the dim light. He stands while he eats, already thinking about the order of the day. An hour in the garden, 2 in the forge, maybe 3 repairing tools, a hunt before dusk, or a long hike to check the fish traps in the eddies where salmon rest during their runs. And always, always he circles back to fire, because fire is the center of everything here. Fire to cook, fire to heat, fire to forge, fire to tan hides, fire to smoke meat, fire to keep the night at bay, and in the flickering glow of his lamps, handmade from clay with wicks floating in fish oil, he reads for hours, devouring books on history and philosophy and physics, carrying entire centuries of human thought into this canyon that most people would have considered empty. It is this combination, physical labor and intellectual hunger, that shapes him into something rare: a scholar with calloused hands, a philosopher with the instincts of a hunter, a craftsman who reads about Kant and nuclear fission between hammer blows, a man whose solitude is not loneliness but sovereignty. And with each passing year, with each winter survived, and each summer harvested, his small kingdom grows in complexity and beauty. But the world outside has not forgotten him entirely, and soon enough, the system he walked away from will come knocking on his door, challenging everything he has built with a single bureaucratic word: eviction. By the mid-1950s, his world had settled into a deep and almost meditative order, a balanced system of stone walls, timber beams, smokehouses, terraces, handmade tools, and carefully tended gardens that worked together like the steady gears of a quiet machine he had shaped with his own hands. And for the first time since descending into Hell's Canyon, he felt a sense of completeness, as though the canyon and his labor had finally fused into a life that made perfect, seamless sense. But just as this fragile peace began to take root, another kind of threat started slipping toward him, not a storm or a predator or a failed harvest, but something far more impersonal and far colder, arriving not on the river but on paper, a government decree drafted by officials who had never walked these cliffs, a regulation declaring that the canyon would become a protected primitive area where permanent human habitation was forbidden, a rule that looked noble in an office, but threatened to erase 24 years of relentless work carved into this unforgiving land. Instead of pleading, surrendering, or considering the idea of leaving the only home he had ever truly built, Sylvan chose to respond in the way only a man who had recreated civilization from scratch could respond, and he began to build again, not a letter or an argument, but a 3-story stone tower rising above the river, like a medieval keep, every rock carried by hand, every defensive slit window carved with intention, the whole structure positioned so that anyone approaching by boat would fall immediately under its silent watch. Rumors drifted along the Salmon River, as rafters began whispering that Buckskin Bill had sworn the government would have to kill him to take his land. And while he never shouted such a threat, he never denied it either, because his calm, steady eyes made it clear that he meant every syllable, and that he would defend this place not out of madness but out of principle, out of a sense that a man who had built his world with his own labor had earned the right to keep it. While the tower climbed higher stone by stone, he tackled another monumental project shaped by the Cold War tension of the era, blasting a bomb shelter directly into the mountain behind his cabin, drilling holes by hand, setting dynamite charges, and hauling rubble out in basket after basket until he had carved a chamber large enough to store months' worth of food, tools, and supplies, ensuring that even if the outside world collapsed, 5 Mile Bar would endure. When the Forest Service rangers finally motored upriver with grim expressions, expecting to confront a trespasser or a dangerous eccentric, they instead found a man whose intelligence and discipline struck them harder than the sight of the tower itself, a man who led them calmly through his handmade world, a lodge engineered to the canyon's extreme climate, a forge pulsing with heat, terraces overflowing with food, tools of remarkable precision, rifles bored by hand, and a life that existed in harmony with the land rather than in defiance of it. The rangers realized quickly that they were not facing an outlaw but a sovereign individual whose life represented not destruction but mastery, and understanding both the futility and the injustice of trying to uproot him, they made the rare and wise decision to back down, writing an exception into the wilderness designation that allowed Sylvan Hart, Buckskin Bill, to remain in the home he had forged. And so the tower never fired a shot, becoming instead a symbol carved in stone that one human being, armed with discipline, knowledge, and a ferocious commitment to personal freedom, could stand firm not only against nature but against the full machinery of government. What made the entire situation even more ironic, and almost tender in a way that only the canyon could reveal, was the quiet truth that Sylvan Hart was never the antisocial hermit outsiders imagined him to be, because beneath the buckskins and the tower and the fierce independence, there lived a man who genuinely enjoyed human conversation when it arrived at his doorstep. And as the years went by and river rafting grew into a popular sport, more and more brightly colored rafts began drifting past 5 Mile Bar, carrying curious travelers who often had no idea that a living legend stood just beyond the willows watching them with mild amusement. Instead of hiding from these strangers or retreating into suspicion, he would step onto his porch in full buckskin attire, the fringe fluttering slightly in the canyon breeze, and cheerfully wave them over with the warm hospitality of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear, and when they accepted his invitation, he would guide them through his small kingdom with a kind of gentle pride, showing them the rifles he had forged from raw steel, the intricate tools he had shaped and tempered, the garden terraces stacked stone by stone, and of course the towering copper samovar he had hammered into existence without ever having seen a real one. He spoke not with the crude simplicity of a mountain recluse, but with the articulate ease of a man who had studied languages, philosophy, physics, and history, and visitors often found themselves stunned, not only by the craftsmanship surrounding them, but by the depth of knowledge in his conversation, as he shifted seamlessly from the geology of the canyon walls to the fall of Rome, from the behavior of elk herds to the ethics of nuclear warfare, his mind as sharp and polished as the tools he kept hanging in neat rows above his anvil. At night, when the visitors were gone, and the river once again murmured in its long rhythmic voice, he would light his handmade oil lamps, small clay vessels filled with salmon oil and a floating wick, and sit at his table reading for hours, turning fragile pages illuminated by a soft, flickering glow, the light tapping gently against the stone walls, while outside the canyon darkened into a vast and star-filled valley where silence fell like snow. He had no electricity, no telephone, no running water, and yet his evenings were richer than those of many who lived surrounded by modern luxury, because his solitude was never empty. It was filled with books carried into the canyon one heavy pack at a time, filled with his own music played on flutes carved from river cane, filled with the echo of folk songs he sang off-key, but with enthusiasm, songs that drifted into the night air like offerings to the cliffs themselves. Yet even in this life he had mastered so completely, hardship never fully disappeared, because Hell's Canyon, beautiful as it was, remained a place of danger, and there were years when the garden struggled, when the hunting was thin, when the river floods tore away his traps, when the winter cold pressed so deeply into the valley that he began to feel his own bones ache with the weight of survival, and these moments reminded him that freedom carried a cost measured not in money, but in endurance, patience, and an unspoken agreement with the land. One of the most brutal reminders came in the winter of 1949, when a fierce blizzard swept down the canyon and buried his cabin under more than 6 feet of snow, sealing the doors and windows so completely that he became trapped inside for 3 long weeks, surviving on rationed food, burning furniture for heat, and reading the same books over and over in the dim light of a fat-soaked wick. And when he finally dug himself out, thin and pale but alive, he treated the experience not as a warning to leave, but as proof that the canyon had tested him once again and found him worthy. Wildlife brought its own dangers. Rattlesnakes coiled beneath warm stones during summer, striking without warning if disturbed, and after being bitten once in 1938, treating himself with a tourniquet and a poultice of wild herbs while fever burned through him for days. He learned to move through the canyon with almost animal awareness, scanning every rock and fallen branch with steady, deliberate caution. Black bears and mountain lions prowled the slopes, but he respected them as neighbors rather than enemies, carrying one of his handmade pistols for emergencies, but relying mostly on instinct and distance to keep the peace. And always, there was the river, powerful and unpredictable, its spring floods capable of rising 10 feet in a matter of hours, tearing away trees, soil, and anything else in their path. And during the Great Flood of 1952, he stood on the hillside watching the Salmon River swell toward his lodge, swallowing the edges of his garden and smashing the fish traps he had so carefully built. Yet even in that moment of destruction he felt a kind of calm acceptance, because he had built his home high enough, strong enough, and with enough foresight that when the water finally retreated, he simply gathered his tools and began the slow work of rebuilding. As the 1960s approached, something unexpected began to happen in the deep solitude of Hell's Canyon, because while Sylvan had spent decades carving out a life designed to keep the world at arm's length, the world itself was quietly changing, and the Salmon River, once considered too wild, too violent, too unforgiving, slowly became a magnet for adventurers seeking challenge and beauty. And with the rise of river rafting, bright flashes of color began appearing on the water, inflatable rafts carrying college students, families, outdoorsmen, and curious travelers who had heard whispers of a strange, brilliant man living alone in buckskins on a patch of remote land called 5 Mile Bar, where another man might have withdrawn deeper into isolation, peering from behind rocks or retreating into silence. Sylvan welcomed this new flow of people with a kind of amused openness, stepping out onto his porch as the rafts drifted near, the fringe of his buckskin shirt stirring in the canyon breeze, raising his hand in greeting, and calling them over with a polite confidence that seemed almost regal in such an isolated wilderness. When they accepted, and most did, because by then the legend of Buckskin Bill had begun to take root, he led them on slow, thoughtful tours of his homestead, moving from the cool stone interior of his 2-story lodge to the heat of his forge to the terraces he had carved into the hillside, explaining his systems not with arrogance but with the quiet pride of a man who has built every object, every tool, every breath of his world through effort rather than convenience, and visitors found themselves disarmed, not just by his craftsmanship, but by the enormous breadth of his intellect. He spoke with the ease of a professor who had chosen to trade lecture halls for canyon walls, weaving together topics like ancient history, nuclear physics, blacksmithing, linguistics, and the seasonal cycles of Idaho wildlife. And his voice, shaped by decades of solitude, but softened by deep curiosity, carried through the stone rooms of his lodge like the low hum of a fire that never quite went out. Some evenings, after the last raft had drifted away and the river resumed its steady murmur, he would sit on his porch with a flute carved from river cane and play simple melodies that echoed off the canyon walls, thin, wavering notes carried upward toward the cliffs until they dissolved into the vast night sky. And though he was alone out there, the sound was not the music of loneliness, but of a man entirely at peace with his place in the world. His rare trips into town, Bergdorf, Idaho, a settlement with more empty chairs than people, only served to deepen the myth surrounding him, because he didn't go for supplies like food or clothing or tools. He went only for three things: tea, books, and gunpowder, paying with gold dust he had panned from the river, and then disappearing again into the canyon before anyone had the chance to ask him too many questions. By the summer of 1966, his quiet fame had grown so much that it reached the editors of Sports Illustrated, who dispatched a writer named Harold Peterson to seek out the last mountain man. And when Peterson finally arrived, expecting a wild-eyed hermit, but finding instead a multilingual scholar in immaculate buckskins, welcoming him like an honored guest, the article that followed introduced Sylvan Hart to the nation, painting a portrait of a man who had stepped outside of modern society, not in rebellion but in mastery, someone who proved by example that the conveniences most Americans depended on were not necessities at all. Letters began arriving from across the country, carried up the salmon by boatmen who knew exactly where to deliver them, and although Sylvan read them with curiosity, sometimes even amusement, he never allowed admiration to alter the rhythm of his days. The forge still needed tending, the garden still needed weeding, the winter stores still needed filling, and knowledge, always knowledge, still needed to be pursued each night by the glow of fish oil lamps in a room lined with books that had been carried one heavy backpack at a time across treacherous canyon paths. Yet even with the growing trickle of visitors, even with the national attention, even with the occasional letter praising his independence, the deeper truth remained unchanged, that his life was not a performance or a rebellion or a tourist attraction, but a long, deliberate act of self-reliance, built on an idea he believed with the steadiness of a heartbeat, that real freedom could only be earned through responsibility, through skill, and through the constant, unbreakable discipline of taking care of one's own existence without leaning on systems that could collapse or shift without warning. As the decades moved quietly forward, the deep solitude of 5 Mile Bar became something like a living museum of human capability, not a museum filled with dusty objects behind glass, but one shaped by the rhythm of the seasons and the disciplined hands of a man who truly believed that every tool you make, every seed you plant, every wall you build is a vote for your own freedom. And in this belief, Sylvan Hart maintained a life that was both simple and astonishingly complex, a life where every morning demanded awareness, every afternoon demanded work, and every evening offered the reward of stillness earned through effort, rather than bought through convenience. Visitors who stayed long enough to watch him move through a day often described his life as a kind of choreography, a seamless transition from task to task, beginning at dawn when he stepped out into the crisp air to read the river's level and the direction of the wind, continuing into the garden as he checked the leaves for signs of stress, then crossing to the forge where he hammered iron into shape, with steady, measured blows, the noise echoing up toward the canyon walls like a heartbeat made of steel, and each movement seemed less like labor and more like a conversation with the land, a kind of slow, ongoing dialogue between man and wilderness. Even his methods of preserving food carried this same sense of patient mastery, because the root cellar carved into the hillside stayed cool year-round and smelled faintly of earth and stone, the smokehouse filled with strips of salmon hanging from wooden rods like red gold curtains, the jars of pickled vegetables lined neatly on shelves carved from the same timber he had felled, and the whole system formed a cycle so self-contained that by autumn his stores were full, by spring nearly empty, and by the next autumn full again, a rhythm so steady and dependable that even his visitors felt calmed by it. Yet despite the tranquility of his routine, nature never allowed him to grow complacent, because Hell's Canyon, in all its brutal beauty, insisted on tests that arrived without warning, floods that tore out the lower terraces, windstorms that rattled the roof beams, dry spells that shriveled the beams, and winters that pressed their weight into the valley like a cold thumb pushing down on a bruise. And through each challenge Sylvan responded not with frustration or despair, but with a kind of practiced patience, repairing what needed repairing and rebuilding what needed rebuilding, confident that anything made with his own hands could be remade by his own hands as many times as necessary. These trials, rather than pushing him away from the canyon, deepened his bond with it. And when he spoke about disaster, whether it was the flood of 52 or the blizzard of 49, he described them not as tragedies but as chapters in a long and complicated relationship with the land, something almost intimate, as though the canyon were not trying to destroy him but to teach him, to carve him into someone who understood, at the deepest level, what survival really meant. And through all these years, the foundation of his world remained knowledge, because every night, no matter how exhausting the day had been, he would light the fish oil lamp, sit at his wooden table, and open one of the hundreds of books he had carried into the canyon, reading texts on metallurgy, botany, anthropology, astronomy, political theory, classical literature, physics, the lives of ancient kings and forgotten philosophers, absorbing ideas with the same hunger with which he tended his garden. And in the quiet glow of the lamp, his weathered face seemed to take on the calm expression of a monk, not one hiding from the world, but one studying it with unbroken focus. The more he read, the more he understood just how vast the world was beyond the canyon, and yet the more certain he became that his narrow piece of land, hard-earned and wholly his, offered a kind of education no university on earth could provide, because living alone in the wilderness required not only intelligence but judgment, intuition, discipline, and the capacity to endure discomfort. And in these qualities he found a deeper satisfaction than any classroom or city would ever have offered him. It was this blend of scholarship and rugged practicality that made him such a compelling figure when rafters stopped by, because they expected a caricature, a wild-eyed hermit, a relic of the frontier, and instead found a man who could discuss the Treaty of Westphalia with the same fluency with which he could explain how to temper steel, a man who moved through his handmade world with the calm assurance of someone who had proven again and again that self-reliance was not a romantic idea, but a daily practice requiring thousands of small, thoughtful decisions. Through all of this, he never once claimed superiority over the people drifting past on rafts or reading about him in magazines. He simply lived the life he had chosen with the quiet conviction that freedom was not something granted by society, but something you built, one stone, one tool, one season at a time, and the canyon, in its stark, indifferent way, accepted him fully because he had accepted it fully, shaping himself to its demands rather than trying to force it into his own expectations. As the years continued their slow and steady march, and the wrinkles deepened around Sylvan's eyes like fine cracks etched by wind and sun, the canyon became not only his home but an extension of himself, a place where every stone on the path, every pine leaning over the river, every seasonal shift from blazing heat to icy stillness, held a memory of some moment he had lived through, some problem he had solved, some challenge he had met with the same quiet stubbornness that had carried him here in the first place. And those who visited often remarked that he seemed almost fused with the landscape, as if the cliffs themselves respected him for the way he had insisted on understanding every inch of their domain. But even in this sense of unity between man and place, there were times when the canyon tested him more harshly than usual, the most dangerous moments often coming not from weather or predators, but from the unpredictability of the river itself, because the salmon, powerful and restless, never fully stopped being a threat. and each spring its cold waters surged with a kind of ancient fury as snowmelt from distant mountains crashed through the gorge, lifting whole logs and boulders as though they were driftwood and swallowing the edges of 5 Mile Bar in a churning, icy roar. During one of these floods, perhaps the worst he ever witnessed, the river rose so high and so fast that Sylvan had barely enough time to secure his tools, seal his food stores, and watch helplessly as the lower terraces of his garden vanished beneath brown, swirling water, the stone walls he had built with such care crumbling under the pressure, the fish traps torn free and carried downstream like twigs. Yet even as he stood on the hillside and watched the destruction unfold, there was no anger in him, only a kind of resigned understanding, because he had learned long ago that nature was not an adversary to be fought, but a force to be endured, and once the water retreated he simply gathered his tools, rolled up his sleeves, and began again to rebuild what had been taken. Perhaps because of these experiences, his respect for the canyon's dangers remained absolute, and he moved through his surroundings with a caution that was almost instinctive, knowing that a single misstep on a loose rock, a careless moment near a rattlesnake hiding between sun-warmed stones, or a quiet misreading of the weather could turn an ordinary day into a fight for survival, and he treated each encounter with nature as an ongoing negotiation, giving predators their space, observing their patterns, understanding when the deer moved low and when the mountain lions followed them, and adjusting his own movements accordingly. Despite the risks, or perhaps because of them, Sylvan found profound beauty in the canyon's harshness, describing with surprising tenderness the way sunrise spilled gold across the cliffs, the way the night sky crowded with stars so bright they seemed to cast faint shadows on the ground, the way elk drifted silently across his land in the autumn twilight, and the way the echo of an eagle's cry could fold itself into the stillness of winter with a kind of lonely grandeur that no city or town could ever imitate. And when he talked about these things to his visitors, his normally calm voice would take on a softness that revealed just how deeply he cherished the world around him. But life in a place as remote as 5 Mile Bar meant that hardship was never truly distant, and even though Sylvan had built systems strong enough to carry him through most seasons, there were still moments of genuine danger, one of the worst being the time he was bitten by a rattlesnake in 1938, a bite that sent searing pain up his leg, swelling and fever that lasted for days, during which he treated himself with nothing but a tourniquet and a poultice of wild herbs, lying in his bed half delirious as the venom worked through him. And when he finally recovered, weak and exhausted but alive, he carried the lesson with him forever, stepping carefully, listening closely, watching every patch of ground with the alertness of a man who has already come close to the edge once and refuses to be caught unaware again. Through all these trials, large and small, his sense of purpose never wavered, because he understood that self-reliance was not a romantic ideal, but a daily discipline, a lifelong commitment that required patience, humility, and an acceptance of discomfort. And this understanding is what allowed him to meet each challenge, not with bitterness or fear, but with the calm endurance of someone who had made peace with the reality that freedom always comes with a price. And even as he welcomed visitors, even as he stood on his porch to greet rafters with that quick, warm smile, he never forgot that at the center of his life was a quiet, unwavering vow that he would remain sovereign on this land he had shaped, that he would live by his own skill rather than by dependence on distant systems, and that whatever tests came his way, weather, wildlife, government, loneliness, he would meet them with the same slow, deliberate determination that had carried him through his very first winter in this canyon so many years earlier. As the story of Buckskin Bill drifted farther beyond the canyon, carried by rafters, whispered by travelers, printed in magazines and retold in small towns, where people marveled at the idea of a man choosing to turn his back on the 20th century, Sylvan himself moved through his days unchanged, because for all the fascination surrounding him, he still rose with the sun, still checked the river's level each morning, still walked the terraces of his garden with a deliberate, measuring gaze, and still entered his workshop with the calm focus of a craftsman who understood that mastery came not from rushing forward, but from repeating the essential tasks of life with steady hands and a clear mind. Even as he gained attention, he remained untouched by the idea of notoriety, regarding visitors not as admirers but as guests, offering them tea brewed from that enormous copper samovar. He had shaped himself, and speaking to them with the same effortless intelligence he once carried into university classrooms, shifting easily from the geology of the canyon's basalt walls to the philosophical tensions of the ancient world, his mind moving so fluidly between ideas that many found themselves almost embarrassed at how wrong their expectations had been before stepping foot on 5 Mile Bar. Peterson's 1966 article in Sports Illustrated, which first introduced him to the nation, portrayed him as both a throwback and a visionary, a man living in the past and yet somehow ahead of his time. And while Sylvan read the article with mild amusement, noting small errors and embellishments, he did not allow it to change him, because the world beyond the canyon seemed so distant, so abstract, and so fragile compared to the immediate and tangible demands of the land around him, demands that required strength, attention, and commitment rather than the shifting opinions of readers hundreds of miles away. Still, the article brought a new wave of rafters, adventurers, and curious souls who treated 5 Mile Bar as a kind of pilgrimage, and when they arrived, many expecting a mythic frontiersman or some wild, eccentric hermit, Sylvan would smile at their hesitancy, shake their hands with surprising gentleness, and invite them into his stone lodge, where the cool interior and the quiet crackling of a small fire created a sense of peace that seemed to slow time to a whisper, the dust motes drifting lazily in the air, while he explained this tool or that wall or the logic behind his irrigation system. Those who stayed long enough, sharing tea, listening to the rhythms of the river, asking questions that revealed their own uncertainties about modern life, often left with a subtle but unmistakable shift in their thinking, a realization that freedom was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of capability, and that a man who could grow his food, build his shelter, make his tools, and defend his land had a kind of inner stability that could not be purchased, borrowed, or handed down. Despite all this attention, the essence of Sylvan's life remained unchanged. He lived through winter nights so cold the breath froze in the air before reaching the ground, through summer days so hot the stone paths seemed to shimmer, through storms that rattled the canyon like a drum, and through quiet evenings, when the world outside his window glowed with the soft orange of sunset reflecting off the river. And through all of it he continued to perfect his skills, refine his systems, and deepen his understanding of the land. His daily routine, simple on the surface, revealed itself as a sophisticated web of interlocking responsibilities, splitting firewood for the winter months, checking the root cellar for signs of moisture, patching the seams of his buckskin clothing with sinew, cleaning the rifling of his hand-forged rifles, repairing the bellows in his forge, smoking fish to carry him through the long cold, reading late into the night, tending wounds and ailments with poultices made from wild plants, and adjusting each part of his life so that it not only functioned effectively, but did so without any reliance on systems beyond his own control. In moments of deep solitude, when the canyon was silent except for the distant crack of a shifting rock or the low murmur of the river, Sylvan would sit on his porch and look out at the steep walls rising into the early evening light, and there was a kind of contentment in his expression, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had not simply survived the wilderness, but had become an expert at living within it, shaping his days with intention and his nights with reflection, and knowing that the passage of time would eventually carry him away just as it carried away the spring runoff each year. What he could not have predicted, though, was that his greatest work, greater even than the guns, the lodge, the terraces, or the tower, would be the legacy he left behind, a legacy no government regulation or natural disaster could erase, because 5 Mile Bar itself became a living testament to his genius, a place where every stone and timber whispered his name long after he was gone, and where future generations would come not just to see what he built, but to feel, even for a moment, the quiet strength of a life lived entirely on one's own terms. As the 1970s crept quietly across the landscape of America, bringing with them cultural shifts, political storms, economic uncertainty, and the slow erosion of the frontier myth in the national imagination, the world beyond Hell's Canyon seemed to move faster and faster, but within that deep and ancient gorge, time still flowed at its old deliberate pace, and Sylvan Hart, unchanged by trends, unbothered by politics, untouched by the rush of the modern world, continued to live in the measured rhythm he had carved into his life decades earlier, rising with the sun, listening to the river, tending his garden, hammering at his anvil, brewing tea in his towering samovar, and filling his evenings with books that carried his mind far beyond the canyon walls. By this time he had become something of a legend, a living paradox who embodied both the past and the future. And yet, if you had asked him whether he felt legendary, he would have likely laughed, shrugged, and returned to whatever task lay in front of him. Because admiration, he believed, was just another distraction, and distractions had no place in a life built on discipline, purpose, and the understanding that self-reliance was not a glamorous story to be told, but a daily practice requiring constant vigilance and quiet determination. Still, as he grew older, there were subtle signs, noticed only by those who visited him often, that the years were beginning to press against him, not in the dramatic way that age suddenly overtakes some men, but in the slow, respectful way the canyon itself had always taught its lessons. A little stiffness in the morning, as he stepped from his bed, a longer pause before lifting a heavy beam, a moment on the porch to catch his breath after climbing the slope to check the irrigation channel. And yet even these signs of age carried a kind of dignity, because he continued to work, to create, to adapt, and to live fully in the world he had chosen. The canyon, for its part, seemed to understand that he was aging, the winters becoming slightly more biting, the floods slightly more destructive, the storms slightly more insistent, as though testing him gently rather than fiercely, and Sylvan responded with the same patient resilience he had shown from the beginning, patching roofs, reinforcing terraces, adjusting his routines to accommodate his changing strength, and leaning more heavily on the knowledge he had spent a lifetime gathering. Each year the stream of rafters passing through grew larger, and those who had once approached 5 Mile Bar with curiosity now approached it with reverence, speaking in hushed tones as they neared the stone tower or the front porch, calling out softly in case he was nearby, and when he emerged, buckskin still hanging neatly from his frame, hair a little whiter, gait a little slower, they greeted him with the kind of respect people usually reserve for scholars or elders, because Sylvan, without ever intending to, had become both. He welcomed them as he always had, showing them the lodge, explaining the tools, demonstrating the rifling of a barrel or the tempering of a blade, and though his hands moved a bit more slowly and his strength was not quite what it had been, the clarity of his mind remained razor-sharp, and he could still discuss the Treaty of Versailles or the thermodynamics of fire with the same eloquence that had astonished visitors 40 years earlier. In those later years, when the nights grew particularly cold and the canyon air pressed down like a heavy blanket, woven from stone and silence, he would sit by the window of his lodge with a book open in his lap, listening to the faint crackle of the fire and the distant movement of the river, and there was something deeply peaceful in the way he turned each page, as though he understood that his life was no longer a struggle against time or nature, but a long, slow conversation with both. Then, on April 29th, 1980, when the spring sun was beginning to warm the canyon, and the snowmelt had started its long descent toward the Salmon River, Sylvan Hart did not rise from his bed, did not step onto the porch to greet the morning, did not stoke the fire or walk down to the garden. He simply remained still beneath his handmade blankets, his tools resting where he had left them, his books arranged neatly on their shelves, his samovar gleaming faintly in the morning light, and he passed from this world with the same quiet dignity that had shaped his entire life. He was 73 years old, a bachelor with no children, a scholar who had become a craftsman who had become a philosopher, and a philosopher who had become, in the truest sense of the word, free, and his body was found by a river guide who had grown accustomed to seeing him wave from the porch at the sound of passing rafters, a guide who felt something was wrong when the canyon remained silent, and who stepped inside the lodge only to discover that Sylvan had died in his sleep, peaceful and untouched by fear. There was no funeral, no headstone, no ceremony of any kind, because such things had never mattered to him, and instead his ashes were scattered into the canyon he had loved, becoming part of the soil and stone and river that had shaped him, and in that quiet act he remained exactly where he had always been, woven into the place he had chosen, not as a ghost of regret, but as a lasting presence held in every wall, every forge mark, every terrace, and every footstep carved into the earth. In the quiet years that followed his passing, when the canyon continued its ancient cycles of scorching summers and frozen winters, when the river rose and fell and rose again like a slow breath, something remarkable began to happen to the place he had loved, because instead of fading back into wilderness or collapsing under the weight of neglect, 5 Mile Bar seemed to hold itself together out of loyalty to the man who had built it, as though the stones he had laid and the beams he had notched refused to let his memory drift into obscurity, and people who had once visited him now returned not to speak with Buckskin Bill but to stand in the world he had shaped. The Forest Service, the same institution that had once tried to remove him, began to see the profound value of what he had created, recognizing that his homestead was not merely a cabin in the wilderness, but a living document of American self-reliance, a place where history, craftsmanship, and human determination had fused into something greater than the sum of its parts, and so they made the unusual and deeply fitting decision to preserve 5 Mile Bar exactly as he had left it, transforming it not into a polished exhibit behind ropes and plaques, but into a museum that felt alive, a space where visitors could still sense the warmth of his hands in the tools he forged, and the sound of his footsteps in the paths worn through the garden. Those who made the journey, whether by jet boat, raft, or on foot, found themselves stepping into a landscape where time seemed to fold in on itself, because the stone lodge stood as solid as ever. The workshop still smelled faintly of coal and iron. The shelves in the kitchen still held wooden bowls and utensils he had carved, and even the samovar, that towering copper creation, remained in its place like a gleaming centerpiece of his ingenuity, and the effect was so powerful that many visitors fell silent upon entering, struck by the realization that the life of this solitary man had become a monument in its own right. His handwriting still marked the walls of the workshop in chalky scrawl, measurements, reminders, small calculations preserved like the sketches of an inventor, and on the anvil lay faint scorch marks from decades of forging, each one a ghost of a moment, when steel met fire under his careful gaze. The tower he had built stood unchanged above the river, its narrow windows staring down at the water with the same quiet defiance as the day it was completed, not as a threat but as a testament to his unwavering desire to defend the freedom he had earned. In the garden, which had once been the beating heart of his survival, a couple living nearby took up the task of tending the soil, planting the same sorts of vegetables he had grown, beans, squash, potatoes, herbs, and visitors often remarked that walking among the terraces felt like stepping into the rhythm of his days, a place where each plant seemed to grow not just from soil but from memory, each leaf whispering something about the patience and persistence that had shaped this unlikely oasis. What made the preservation of 5 Mile Bar so extraordinary was that it was not merely an effort to honor the past, but an acknowledgement that Sylvan Hart had created something that transcended his own lifetime, something that spoke to a longing many people carried without even realizing it, a longing for autonomy, for competence, for the quiet assurance that comes from knowing you can provide for yourself with your own hands, and for the inner stillness that blooms when you remove yourself from the frantic machinery of modern life. In 2019, decades after his death, the US Forest Service officially recognized 5 Mile Bar as a historic site, ensuring that the place would be protected not as empty wilderness, but as a living tribute to the man who had transformed it from raw canyon into a world of his own making. And the irony of this recognition was not lost on those who knew the story. The same government that once sought to evict him now preserved his home as a symbol of American ingenuity, resilience, and independence. And so his legacy grew into something larger than any single structure or tool, larger even than the legend of Buckskin Bill itself, because what he demonstrated, with simple constancy and without ever meaning to make a statement, was that a human being armed with knowledge, discipline, and patience can live not as a dependent part of a system, but as a sovereign individual, building a life in which every object is understood, every need is met through skill rather than consumption, and every day is shaped by intention instead of obligation. His story continues to resonate, because it challenges the assumptions most people hold about progress and comfort, gently suggesting that modern convenience may have come at the cost of old capabilities, and reminding those who visit his canyon home that self-sufficiency is not a romantic fantasy, but a demanding and deeply rewarding way of life. And even though the world now runs faster than ever, swallowed by noise, screens, and endless distraction, something in the human spirit still recognizes the quiet power of a man who stepped away from it all, and proved with nothing but his hands, his mind, and his will, that freedom is something you build, not something you're given. And so, in the deepest canyon in North America, surrounded by cliffs older than memory and a river that never stops moving, the spirit of Sylvan Hart remains woven into the stone, echoed in the forge, preserved in the tower, alive in the garden, and every visitor who walks through that quiet bar of land feels, even for a moment, the calm strength of a life lived entirely on one's own terms. Even now, long after the dust of his footsteps has settled, and the sound of his hammer no longer echoes through the canyon walls, people who visit 5 Mile Bar often describe an uncanny feeling that settles over them the moment they step onto the old path leading to his lodge, a sense that the place is not abandoned at all, but quietly alert, as if the canyon itself remembers him and holds his presence with the same gentle certainty with which it holds the river that carved it. And that feeling grows stronger as they move from room to room, noticing small details that seem frozen in time. They see the wooden bed frame he carved with patient hands, the simple table where he brewed tea and read philosophy late into the night, the racks of tools arranged with the neatness of a man who respected order not for appearance but for survival, and in the workshop they see the iron shavings still gathered in small drifts on the floor, each one a tiny fragment of effort from long days of shaping steel under fire and sweat. And even the forge itself seems as though it could roar back to life if someone simply worked the bellows the way he once did. Visitors often pause at the samovar, the great copper and brass vessel standing like a sculpture in the corner of the kitchen, and they marvel at how something so ornate, so polished, so utterly out of place in a remote wilderness came to exist here. And then they remember that it is actually perfectly in place because it was created in this very spot, forged and hammered into shape by a man whose imagination and skill allowed him to bridge worlds, bringing a piece of old Russia into the American frontier, simply because he wanted to drink his tea the way he had envisioned it from books. Perhaps the most haunting sight for many is the tower, rising above the riverbank with the same silent confidence it had when he first stacked the stones that form its walls, and from its narrow windows visitors can see the very same stretch of river he once watched, the same glint of sunlight rippling across the water, the same swirling eddies where salmon still rest during their long migrations, and there is something strangely comforting in knowing that the view has hardly changed, that nature has continued to move in its ancient cycles while the tower remains as both a guardian and a gravestone to one man's unshakable resolve. What surprises most people, though, is that the place does not feel lonely. Rather, it feels inhabited not by a ghost but by the accumulated weight of a life lived with intention. The kind of intention that is rare in the modern world, where days slip by unnoticed and achievements often feel borrowed or second-hand. And in contrast, everything here, every shelf, every wall, every hand-forged hinge, seems to radiate the quiet truth that nothing in Sylvan Hart's world was accidental, that every object held a purpose, and every purpose held a piece of his identity. Park rangers who tend the property speak often of how visitors fall silent when they enter his workshop, how conversations quiet into whispers as people absorb the atmosphere of patient labor, and how even children who know nothing of his story instinctively understand that they are standing in a place shaped by someone extraordinary, someone who did not merely survive but thrived through competence, discipline, and an almost artistic devotion to self-reliance. School groups sometimes arrive with the same restless energy that follows children everywhere, but something happens as the guide begins to explain how he melted down scrap metal to create gun barrels, how he tanned hides using the deer's own brain, how he grew thousands of pounds of potatoes on terraces he built with his bare hands, and gradually the children begin to imagine a life so different from their own, so free from noise, from screens, from dependency, that they fall silent, picturing what it would feel like to wake up in this canyon with nothing but your own skill standing between you and the world. Even those who come from cities, who live in apartments with climate control and elevators and grocery stores open all night, feel an unexpected stirring in their chest when they walk through the rooms of his lodge, a quiet echo of something older and deeper, something that whispers that human beings were not always meant to live cushioned from the realities of nature, that there is a certain clarity that comes only from being responsible for your own needs. And though few who visit would choose his life for themselves, almost all of them leave with a sense of longing they cannot fully explain. In this way, the legacy of Sylvan Hart extends far beyond the stone walls of 5 Mile Bar, reaching into the modern world like a gentle question posed to anyone who hears his story. Have we traded too much of our independence for convenience? Too much of our skill for ease? Too much of our resilience for comfort? And is there some part of us, buried beneath the daily noise, that still yearns to build, to create, to survive, to know ourselves the way he did? And this question, more than the tower or the lodge or the workshop or even the legend of Buckskin Bill, is what keeps his story alive. Because in a time when most people are surrounded by tools they cannot repair, systems they do not understand, and comforts they cannot reproduce, the life of Sylvan Hart stands as a reminder that one person, guided by curiosity, intellect, and unbreakable will, can build a complete world with nothing but patience, fire, and the stubborn belief that freedom must be earned every single day. And so, as the modern world pressed deeper into the 21st century with its glowing screens, its restless pace, its relentless hunger for novelty and convenience, the little stone lodge in Hell's Canyon continued to rest in its quiet cradle of cliffs and pine, untouched by noise or hurry, unchanged by trends or technologies, a place where the faint smell of smoke still lingered in the beams, and the wind still slipped through the terraces, with the same soft whisper Sylvan once listened to each morning, and the river, eternal and untamed, continued to slide past his front door like a long silver thread stitching the canyon together. People who visit often speak of a strange moment that comes near the end of their walk, usually as they stand just outside the workshop door, or place a hand on the cool stone wall of the lodge, a moment when the noise of their own thoughts fades, and a deeper silence settles inside them, as though the canyon itself were offering a kind of permission to pause, to breathe, to remember that life can be built slowly and deliberately, that meaning emerges not from speed but from attention, and that strength grows not from comfort but from the patient cultivation of skill. And as they look around at the tools he forged, the walls he shaped, the pathways he wore into the earth, they begin to understand that Sylvan Hart did not simply live off the grid or away from society. He lived according to a philosophy that was older than any nation, any system, any economy. a philosophy that said human beings become most themselves when they learn to do for themselves, when they embrace the responsibility of shaping their own survival, and when they face the world not as passive consumers but as active creators. For some, this realization brings a quiet sadness, a recognition of how much has been lost in the rush toward convenience. How many skills once considered essential have slipped away into obscurity, and how modern life, for all its comforts, often leaves people feeling strangely fragile, dependent on systems they cannot see and institutions they cannot influence. Yet for others this same moment brings a kind of inspiration, a lift in the heart as they imagine what it might feel like to reclaim even a small piece of the autonomy Sylvan embodied, to plant a garden, to fix a tool, to build something with their own hands, to rediscover a part of themselves that the noise of the world had muffled. In this way, the story of Buckskin Bill has become more than a story. It has become a mirror, reflecting back to each visitor something different, depending on what they bring with them: a fear of vulnerability, a longing for independence, a curiosity about forgotten skills, or simply a desire for a quieter, more intentional life. And the canyon, with its patient, ancient silence, seems to hold space for all of these responses without judgment. Perhaps this is why so many people return, not out of morbid fascination with a hermit's lifestyle, but out of respect for the clarity his life represents, the clarity that comes from cutting away everything unnecessary until only the essentials remain: shelter, food, fire, knowledge, community when offered, solitude when chosen, and the deep pride that comes from knowing that your survival depends on your own hands rather than on the unpredictable machinery of the world. And as the sun sets behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple before the stars spill out in a great sweeping arc overhead, it is easy to imagine Sylvan stepping out of his lodge one last time, resting his palm on the terraced stones he built, listening to the river breathing steadily below, and feeling entirely satisfied that he had lived exactly the life he intended, a life shaped not by circumstance but by choice, not by fear but by knowledge, not by dependence but by freedom. In that sense, his true inheritance to the world is not a museum, not a tower, not even the legend he left behind, but a question carried on the wind that moves through Hell's Canyon each night. What might your life look like if you stripped away everything that does not matter? If you trusted your own hands, your own mind, your own resilience, and if you chose, even in some small way, to live with the same quiet courage with which he lived? And long after visitors have returned to their homes, long after the sun has dipped below the ridge, and the canyon is held only in moonlight, the river keeps moving, the stones keep holding their places, the garden keeps breathing in the rhythm of the seasons, and the legacy of Sylvan Hart drifts gently across the water like a soft echo, a reminder that even in the vast, complicated modern world, one determined human being can still carve out a life of absolute clarity, intention, and peace. In the end, as the night settles gently over Hell's Canyon and the hush of darkness gathers in the folds of the cliffs, it becomes clear that the story of Sylvan Hart is not merely the biography of a solitary man, nor a tale of eccentricity, nor even a celebration of old-world toughness, but rather a quiet, enduring meditation on what it truly means to be free, because in a century marked by rapid change and growing dependency, he demonstrated with unwavering consistency that freedom is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of capability, not the rejection of society, but the acceptance of responsibility, and not the escape from the world, but the deliberate shaping of one's own place within it. His life, lived in that deep, narrow canyon carved by a river older than memory, stands as a reminder that human beings are capable of far more than they imagine when they allow themselves to slow down, to listen to the world around them, and to commit fully to whatever task lies in front of them, whether it is forging a blade, building a wall, growing a garden, or simply sitting quietly beneath the stars with a book and a cup of tea brewed in a hand-hammered copper samovar. And as we leave his story behind, drifting back from the stone lodge to our own lives filled with noise and urgency, There is something almost comforting in knowing that 5 Mile Bar still exists, still standing exactly where it has always been. The river still flowing past the tower he built, the garden still catching the morning light, the forge still resting in its familiar silence, all of it holding steady like a small island of intention in a world that often feels scattered and unmoored. Because the truth is that Sylvan Hart did not simply build a home. He built a philosophy, a way of being that continues to resonate long after his footsteps have faded from the canyon floor, a philosophy that asks us to consider what strength might look like if it were rooted not in dominance, but in understanding, not in wealth but in skill, not in speed but in patience, and not in comfort but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that we are capable of more than we allow ourselves to believe. And so, as you rest now, letting the story settle softly into your thoughts like embers drifting down from a dying fire, perhaps the greatest gift of his life is the stillness it leaves behind, the gentle invitation to breathe a little deeper, to move a little slower, to pay a little more attention to the world around you, and to remember that even in a world full of distractions, there remains a place within each of us where freedom is built by hand, one choice, one skill, one moment of courage at a time. Sleep well, my friend, and may the calm strength of Sylvan Hart's story stay with you through the night, reminding you that no matter how loud or complicated life becomes, there is always a deeper, quieter path waiting to be found, one carved not by circumstance but by intention.